Today is Monday, July 18th, 2016. My name is Ann Peskin. It is my honor and privilege today to interview Richard Freedman for the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Good afternoon. Please tell me your name.
Richard Freedman.
And where and when were you born?
I was born March 25th, 1964 in Stamford.
So how old are you?
52.
And we're going to talk about your family. Start with your grandparents. Where did they live?
So my maternal grandparents were, my mother and my maternal grandparents were from Queens. My paternal grandparents, I think my grandmother was born in Russia and came here as a young girl and grew up in Bridgeport. My grandfather, the Freedman, goes back several generations in the United States, so I'm told. My grandfather was from New Haven. They married, and they were living in New Haven when my father was born, and they moved here when he was 3.
And what did they do for a living?
My grandmother was a homemaker, and my grandfather was first he was a salesman, and then he was an entrepreneur. He had a business selling baby tendas, which was a kind of high chair that was sold door to door, which is, you can't even imagine anything being sold door to door today. Sold door to door after the war. Of course, selling high chairs after the war was a good business, and then he sold that business and he bought High Ridge Country Club up on High Ridge Road, ran that as a private club, and then eventually sold that. I think he was in his mid-50s, and he retired young. Yeah, he retired when he was in, I believe, his mid-50s. I never knew him as a working person. I have no memories of him working.
Now let's talk about your parents.
So my mother is, like I said, is from Queens. My father wasn't born here, but he was effectively a Stamford native because he moved here as a baby. So my mother went to college quite young. She was 16, and my father went through the Stamford public schools. The humorous story about my father is that I think he lived in 6 or 7 different houses in Stamford when he was growing up, because my grandparents were constantly upward mobile. So he lived on West Broad Street, he lived on Prospect Street, he lived on Skyview Drive, High Ridge Road, Newfield Avenue. They lived all over. Urban Street. They lived all over the place. So he went through the Stamford High class of '51, and my parents met in graduate school. My father was at Harvard Law School, and my mother was getting her master's in mathematics, and they met at a mixer up in Cambridge.
And then what kind of upbringing, or were you a Jewish upbringing, did you have?
We had, I would say, a traditional Jewish upbringing in that we were members of a temple, Temple Bethel, the conservative synagogue in Stamford. I wouldn't say we were particularly observant, but all 3 of us were. I have two older sisters. We were all bar mitzvahed, went to services on high holidays. We did not keep kosher. I still don't. But you know, I definitely had a Jewish identity growing up, and most of my friends actually growing up were Jewish.
Now, what was your we're going into the politics now.
Yeah.
What was your family's involvement in politics in this community?
Well, my father was very involved. to a point, I should say. He was really in it for the public service aspect of it, not because he had some grander, greater personal ambitions that he wanted to satisfy through being in politics. So he was active in the Democratic Party locally here. He ran for state rep, I believe, in the late 60s, pretty much as a sacrificial lamb. I don't think he had any illusions that he was going to win. And then he ran for, in a similar way, he ran for town clerk in 1972 against, at the time, town clerk Lou Claps, who eventually became mayor. Well, Lou Claps couldn't be beaten, so he just ran to fill the ticket because he was a good party guy. And I think to everybody's shock and surprise, his running mate, Fred Lenz, won for mayor. And he had gotten to know Fred during the campaign, and Fred named him his corporation counsel after he got elected. So at the time, the mayoral terms in Stamford were 2 years. My father was corp counsel, which then and nominally now, I believe, is a part-time job, but that's preposterous. It's hardly a part-time job. It's more than a full-time job. And when I think about that, he was building the family business, raising 3 kids, and the corp counsel. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that he did all those things with no email and fax or any of those kinds of things. So he was corp counsel for 2 years. He was extremely controversial. He was a very strongly good government guy, and I think Stamford municipal governance was more corrupt back then than it is now, far more corrupt. And he did some things that were very unpopular. And so in 74, Lenz was voted out. He lost. So he's only a one-term mayor. My father stepped down. 2 years later, my father decided that he wanted to run for the Board of Finance. He could not get the party's nomination, so he primaried, which is amazing to think that he would primary and run a primary, and he won the primary. He won election. He was on the Board of Finance for 4 years. He tells me he got into some knockdown, drag-out fights with Ellen Kamhai, who was on the Board of Ed at the time. The school population was shrinking at the time, and he was, at least on a municipal level, he's fairly conservative, not on a federal level or state level, and voted to cut the Board of Ed budget a couple of times, got into some, I think, bitter disputes with her. They didn't talk for years. In 1980, he got voted off. He ran again, got voted off, and that was it. He got very frustrated. He had had some unfair coverage in The Advocate, one incident in particular, I think, that really upset him, that he thought was very unfair. There was a whole series of articles on what were alleged ethical violations by him involving our business, Garden Homes, and some decisions he had made on the Board of Finance. He got left a very bad taste in his mouth, and he never was in local politics again after 1980, which was really the great loss of this city, that they never had him in office. And he was young in 1980; he was 47, so he was never in politics again after that.
Was the conversation at the dinner table at all political?
Little bit, not really. I mean, we're not, in our family is really my father and me as far as the involvement in governance goes, but we're not really in it for the political aspect of it. We're in it as a form of public service, really. So, I mean, we talk politics now, of course, we talk politics all the time, but we talk more national
Oh,
politics.
how could you? Oh.
Right.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Yale.
And were you involved in any political activities there?
I was not. No, I wasn't. I wasn't in the political union. I was not involved in that stuff at all in college.
And did the education that you got influence you at all in terms of politics or of a political view?
My greatest I mean, Yale was certainly pretty liberal at the time, and it still is, but I think my political views come mainly from my parents.
And who is your political hero growing up, or who was growing up?
You know, I saw that question and I couldn't think of anybody. I can remember intensely disliking Reagan. I think I was 16 when he was elected, but I can't remember thinking that anybody was somebody that I would want to emulate. I could not think of who that person was.
And now, how would you define politics to you?
Well, politics for me is really, as I've said, it's everybody should do something in their lives to serve others, whether it's volunteering in a nonprofit or working with your kids' Little League or whatever it is that you're going to do. For me, because I have a business and I have kids, and I saw my father's example, I want to do something where I can get the greatest impact for whatever time that I'm going to put in. And local government always seemed like a really good way to do that, because local government, the levers are enormous. They are absolutely huge. So I like to be involved in those kinds of decisions and helping to make those kinds of decisions, and that's why I decided to get involved. But yes, you do have to have some political instincts to get involved. You can't be a complete, right? You can't completely ignore that aspect of what you're doing.
When did you decide to get involved? I kind of feel we had a chance to talk.
Yeah, so I always knew at some point I wanted to get involved in local governance, because I had my father's example. I wasn't sure when that would be, but in 2005, there was an opening on the Board of Ed, and actually an acquaintance of mine, I wouldn't even say a really close friend, but an acquaintance said, you know, there's an opening and you should run. You should definitely run for the Board of Ed. And I thought about it, and I talked to my wife, and you know, in 2005 I had 3 young kids. In 2005 I had an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And I thought, okay, you know, I've been wanting to do this for a while. I'll run. And that happened to be a mayoral election year. Dan Malloy was at the top of the ticket. The top of the ticket tends to carry along the rest of the ticket with it, and also for the down ticket races in Stamford, the Board of Ed, the Board of Reps, the Board of Finance tend to vote Democratic in Stamford more than the mayor, and so I got elected.
Obviously, are in the Democratic Party.
Correct, I'm a Democrat.
And you've held not only the Board of Ed, what other office?
Right now, I'm on the Board of Finance, and I'm the chair right now. And I'm actually serving. I'm serving on the Board of Finance with Dudley Williams, who's also a former Board of Ed member, and we've determined that as far back as you can look, we're the only 2 members. We're the only 2 people who have gone from the Board of Ed to the Board of Finance. Other people have done the reverse, including Dan Malloy himself, but we're the first 2 to actually go in that direction.
So how long have you been serving on the board?
I was on the Board of Ed for one term. I only lasted one term on the Board of Ed. And I've been on the Board of Finance now. I'm into my third year. It's a 4-year term.
Going to continue again?
Yeah, if the party will nominate me, I would think I will run again. That would be next year.
Who were your mentors in politics?
When I got on the Board of Ed, I would say I really had one main mentor, Marty Levine, who is an exemplary public servant. He's smart, he's thoughtful, and he's in it for all the right reasons. Those are the worst people you run into in politics, people who have some unfulfilled ego need and are filling that by being in local office, people who need attention, people who have greater ambitions. Those people are always the worst people to serve with. People like Marty, who are in it just to do what they believe is the right thing for their fellow citizens in a selfless way, they're the absolute best. And Marty is like he's the ultimate example. And he had been on the Board of Ed at that point for a long time, 7 or 8 years. Yeah, I think when I was elected, he had already been he was into his 3rd term. And he had been the chairman of the planning, of the zoning board, so he had been involved in public service in Stanford for a long time, and he had a lot of fine advice.
Oh, good. Who were your supporters?
Well, Board of Ed elections and Board of Finance elections in Stanford, they're pretty quiet. You kind of put your name on the ballot and then you sort of run, and the elections are very quiet. I mean, I had some local people who made contributions, and like I said, this acquaintance of mine, Cindy Grafstein, who's actually now works for the mayor, she was like the person who kind of pushed me into running. So I guess you could call her my main supporter.
Okay. What obstacles did you find, if any?
When I was on the board?
Yeah.
Well, I was involved in a series of very controversial decisions when I was on the Board of Ed. Particularly in my 3rd year on the Board of Ed, I was the president, and we went through redistricting, which is a horrific process. The Board of Ed almost never does it because they just can't stomach it. And it had actually been, the process had been initiated by Marty, and then his term expired and he did not run again. And so then it was kind of left to me as the president of the board, and I could have either terminated it or pushed it forward, and I decided to do the latter. And it was tough, because we were both redistricting and we were also opening a school at the same time, which was what's now the Rogers Magnet School. And so we had made when I say we, I mean basically the superintendent and I, and then the rest of the board made the decision that we could not afford to open that school without closing another school. So we were both redistricting and choosing a school to close. And that was a brutal process. And I have to say, my biggest obstacle in that whole process was the mayor. Dan Malloy was the mayor at the time. And we actually had some significant policy-based, not personal. We had some significant conflict, almost entirely behind the scenes. But it was brutal. It really was. And it just consumed an unbelievable amount of time.
Did you have any town hall meetings in reference to that?
We had the Board of Ed, probably in the span of 4 months, I bet we had 10 or 15 public meetings. Hundreds of people came to the most controversial of them, and that was really hard. And actually, and at the time, actually, the Board of Finance also got involved in a not helpful way. So it became highly politicized, and which that's okay, right? That's how the process works. But we got through it, but it was a very tough process.
So you had one session, one election. Did you want to go back to do the board again, or was one section enough?
This whole redistricting process took place in the third year of my term, and I just burned out. I just couldn't do it anymore. I was thinking about the Board of Ed all the time. I was not thinking about our business. I was away from my kids all the time, and they were quite young at the time. There are not many people on the Board of Ed, ironically, who have young kids in the district, which is unfortunate, but that's how it works. And I just couldn't do it anymore. I could not run again, so I just stepped down.
Let's go back to the campaign. You said it was quiet.
Right.
How'd you get the money?
I wrote a letter, basically. So I put together a whole big list of people, and I wrote a letter. I had a couple of people who, friends of ours, had a fundraiser for me. Another friend of mine went out and solicited donations for me. I think raising money it's important. And this is advice that I got from Marty, actually. You need to raise money because you need to engage people in your campaign. So anyone who gives you money then gets vested in your campaign and talks to other people. Does the actual money make that much difference? I don't think so. I think I raised $15,000 or $16,000, which for a Board of Ed candidate is pretty significant. But in the context of trying to reach an electorate of, I think 25,000 people voted that year in a city of 125,000, I don't think $16,000 does a whole lot. I mean, it doesn't swing very many votes. So, but it's important to raise money, as I said, because it gets people engaged.
I have a question in terms of your nomination. You went from the Board of Ed, and then you went to Board of Finance. Did you have any difficulty with the Board of Reps to get on the ballot? It's a city committee.
Yeah, the city. I didn't, but I didn't because I waited. In both cases, I really waited until the time was right to run. So, I mean, the Board of Ed, the party typically needs candidates almost every election. I mean, there's 9 members, there's typically 6 Democrats, there's a Board of Ed election every year. Fewer people want to serve on the Board of Ed because it's so time consuming, and so almost every election the party is looking for reasonable candidates. Board of Finance is different. Board of Finance is only 6 members. You serve a 4-year term. The elections are only every other year. There's only usually four Democratic seats on the Board of Finance, so the number of seats is many fewer, and people tend to serve for longer on the Board of Finance because it's less work, frankly, than the Board of Ed, and so people last longer on that board, and so the number of vacancies that come available where you're not a straw candidate. In other words, you're running for a seat that really is available. You're not just on the ticket to fill a slot and you don't really have a chance of being elected because there would be too many Democrats if you. So first of all, I wasn't going to go right back onto a board after I stepped down from the Board of Ed, but I waited until there was actually a seat. And Tim Abazia, I believe, said he was not going to be running for re-election. He had been on the Board of Finance for a long time, 10 or 12 years. And so when he stepped down, I said, the time is right. I think I'd like to run. And so at that point, I mean, I'm former Board of Ed president, right? So I was, I guess, as good as anybody in that particular cycle to be nominated to run. So
You were lucky.
yeah, it was not contested.
That helps. Now let's talk about some of the issues. On the Board of Finance were you involved in?
The Board of Finance, I would say, is a quieter board than the Board of Ed. The Board of Ed is an operating board, right? It's running the school district day to day. The Board of Finance is an oversight board. The mayor runs the city day to day, not the Board of Finance, although some people on the Board of Finance think they're running the city, but they're not. So we have much less work to do, and our issues are not nearly as controversial as the Board of Ed. So it's definitely, our main thing that we do is we review the budget, we cut the budget where appropriate, we set the mill rate. That's something we do every year. And other than that, I'd say our main roles have been, the two main things that we've done in the last 2.5 years that I've been on the board is approve the new school on Strawberry Hill Avenue, approve the capital funding for that, and approve the capital funding for the police station. I would say actually on the school, the Board of Finance had a pretty important role on that, because the Board of Ed said they needed, it made the case that they didn't have the capacity in the elementary schools and that they needed a new school. And the Board of Finance made it very clear to the Board of Ed that we would not approve a locally funded school, that the city couldn't afford it. And that ended up, I think, forcing the Board of Ed to look for other solutions, and they ended up coming up with a plan to build an interdistrict magnet school, which is paid for mostly by the state of Connecticut, which has worked out quite well for everyone all around. The Board of Ed gets their school, and the kids get their school, and the city's financial contribution is dramatically reduced. But I'm not sure they would have done that had we not forced them to look at it. They might have just taken what they, the Board of Ed doesn't worry about the fiscal implications of things as much. And that's the Board of Finance's job, right? So.
What was the proudest moment in your political career?
The proudest moment of my political career actually was when I got the redistricting plan approved by the Board of Ed on an 8-to-1 vote. So by the time the whole thing got through, it was approved with nearly unanimous support.
Let's take the other side. What was the most regrettable moment?
The most regrettable moment was part of that same process where we had to pick a school to close, and the school that I was championing to be closed was not closed. It was closed by, the board voted to close a different school. And I felt that was a significant racial injustice to the minority population of Stamford. I think the board picked the wrong decision, picked the wrong school. But as Marty actually said to me, he was off the board at that point. As Marty said to me after that vote, he basically said, well, you got a school closed, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I said, you're right. And I moved on, but that was unfortunate, actually. So.
Tell me, has being Jewish helped or hurt your political career at all?
Being Jewish, I think of it, sort of the tribal nature of Stamford politics, and I guess all communities have the same thing. I think it's finally changing in Stamford now, just now, with the election of David Martin as the mayor. But you don't have a huge electoral base when you run as Jew in Stamford. You just don't, right? Nominally, they say there are 10,000 Jews in Stamford. I don't know how accurate that is, but there are far more Irish and way more Italians in Stamford. So, a large percentage of the mayors, for example, in Stamford have been Italian. And a lot of the people who serve on the citywide, certainly on the Board of Finance, but on the citywide boards are Italian, and to a lesser degree they're Irish, like Dan Malloy. And so being Jewish was never a very large electoral base to run from, and so you kind of hope that people just vote for who they think the best candidate is. And, you know, people don't have a lot of information when they vote for these local offices, including mayor. I mean, they make their decisions based on, you know, who knows. Certainly helps to be a native, that's for sure. But, you know, Jews have small families, Italians have large families, and I have Italian friends who are also natives. They know like 6 times as many people as I do. So, and that kind of spreads out when you run for office. And so, I've never faced any anti-Semitism, but I would say just from a practical numbers perspective, I've run from a smaller electoral base than some of my opponents do. But, you know, as the city turns over, right, some of that is going away. Although the older people are the people who vote in the municipal elections, they're the people who were born here, right? So it's going away, but it's really slow. But the fact that David Martin, who's not Jewish, but his wife Judy is, and they're members of a Havurah, the fact that he beat Mike Fedeli, who's Italian and nearly a Stanford native, is a milestone in Stanford politics, I would say.
Now, your children, would you want them to be in politics?
I would, yeah. I think you can, if you're going to spend your time doing, like I said before, some kind of public service, I think politics is a fine way to do it, and I think politics gets a bad name. And you know, the fact that there's so many unaffiliated voters these days speaks to the level of disengagement, I think, in political life in this country. And you know, I feel like just make a decision. You know, either register as a Democrat or register as a Republican. But don't say, I hate all politicians, I can't stand politics. It's you know, a curse, a pox on your house for being involved in politics. I think that's, because the numbers don't lie. I mean, if you're an unaffiliated voter, it means you vote less frequently than people who are registered either as D's or R's. That's a basic statistical truth, like half. The turnout of the U's is like half of what it is from the D's and the R's, and so it's not just you saying that you don't believe in politics. It's also you saying that you don't want to be engaged. And so for my kids, I think if they want to get involved in local, or my son says he wants to be senator. He said that's what he wants to do for his career. I'm like, well, that's great, but there's only 2 of those from Connecticut. If you end up back here or wherever you end up, there's only 2. So you might want to think about, you know, something else, just in case that doesn't work out. Yeah, at any level, I think politics is a fine pursuit.
Now, what legacy do you think you're not leaving behind because you're still involved in it?
Well, that's kind of a grand, you know. I mean, I was on the Board of Finance for 1 term. I was on the Board of Ed. I'm sorry, for 1 term. I'm in the middle of my first term on the Board of Finance. You know, so how much legacy, quote unquote, am I going to leave? That's kind of I'd be happy just to do a good job, and for people to say he was a mensch, he was a decent guy, you know, he was honest, he did what he felt was the right thing, and he was fair. That would be good enough for me.
We've talked a while. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
No, I think I'm good, and I thank you for the opportunity to tell some of my stories and for your time.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And so did you sign the release form?
I did.
And did you understand it?
I did.
Thank you.
Okay.